Hi, everyone. I'm Dan. I'm one of the co-founders and the chief product officer at Clever. And in a prior life, I was a teacher and a tech director in Denver, Colorado. I'm really excited to welcome you to season 2 of Elevating EdTech. This is the series where we all get to learn from leaders about critical issues for growing EdTech companies. Today, I am thrilled to have Adam Pisoni, a good friend and a great mentor, as our guest to kick off season 2. Adam is one of the entrepreneurs I've learned the most from in the world, and I think we're all going to learn a ton from him today. Adam started not just one, but two, actually, you were telling me earlier, just three really impactful companies. And Adam's done it all with really deep thinking and great reflection. He's someone who loves to share what he's learned with others. So I can't wait for all of us to learn from Adam about how we should think about diversity as we grow our teams. And this is an area where Adam has lots to share. So in a second, I'll get the conversation started and ask Adam about how he got started as an entrepreneur. But first, I want to take care of a few housekeeping details. All right, so first of all, this is a live webinar, and you're gonna have an opportunity in the second half of our conversation to ask us anything. So you can ask questions through Zoom, or you can tweet. If you tweet, please tweet @Clever with the hashtag #ElevatingEdTech. I will say we will prioritize Twitter questions over Zoom questions. We like to have a little bit of a public conversation. So please get your Twitter accounts ready. It's your chance to ask Adam and I anything that you'd like. Also, this session is being recorded. So if you have your pencil and notebook out, scribbling furiously and taking notes, you don't need to do that. Sit back, relax. You'll get an email this week with a copy of the webinar for your records. All right, I think that's all the housekeeping that we wanted to cover. So let's get things started with a conversation. Adam, it's great to have you here.
Good to be here.
Yeah. Before we jump into the questions, though, I do want to call something out. We are two white guys about to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion. And I want to talk a little bit why we're doing that. At least we talked about this before, and our perspective isn't, hey, we've got this all figured out and we're the experts and we're going to lecture you about what you need to do. That's definitely not the case. I think we both acknowledge we have a lot to learn.
Yeah.
But we also have learned a few things, and Adam's learned a ton over the course of our experiences. And we want to share what we learned. And we actually want to use our platform and maybe some of our privilege to kind of push the dialogue further in the way that we can. We also want to learn from you. So if you've got ideas or suggestions, please ask them include them as a question. We'd love to learn from the audience. We know we don't have all the answers. Anything else you want to add there?
No, just that, again, recognizing that the situation where two white guys talking about this, and I think beyond attempting to be the best leader I can be, I think it's important for us to help other leaders who are maybe from groups that are more underrepresented in leadership, attain leadership, do better as leaders. And so certainly that's part of how I want to use my platform.
That's awesome. So Adam, we're going to get into the work you've done at Abl Schools in just a second, and the amazing diverse team you've built. But I think before we get there, it's really important to talk a little bit about some of your early experiences that shaped your life and kind of made diversity a passion for you.
Yeah.
So you've got an incredible story. I don't think we'll be able to get into all of it, but I'd love for you to maybe connect some of the dots from being a high school dropout to co-founding a company that sells Yammer, that sells to Microsoft for $1 billion, and how some of the experiences along the way shaped your perspective on diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, I'll try to give the brief version so we can get into the meat of it. But I was born in New York, moved to Phoenix when I was about 4, so really started school in New York and in Phoenix, and went to public schools while I was there. And for reasons that I still don't quite understand, I had a pretty poor experience in all the way from sort of K through 12. Not just because I felt the level of rigor in the educational system there was pretty poor and we weren't learning a lot, but also personally, I was just picked on a lot by other students. And again, for reasons I don't quite understand, but once I got to high school and had decent grades the whole time, I had decided that this school was not really a learning institution, it was more a discipline institution. And went to the guidance counselor and asked if there was a way to test out and go to college. And the guidance counselor told me there wasn't and I should drop out. And so after working to convince my parents, they let me drop out. And I ended up going to community college for a year and then dropping out to start my first company. So I now have a junior high diploma as my highest credential. But once I got out of high school, I never again experienced being picked on or any other kind of, in fact, as a kind of middle-class white person, I likely only experienced tailwinds. I certainly, even as a high school and college dropout, had examples of other famous people who looked like me who'd done amazing things. But I think that connecting the dots to now, I mean, I eventually started my first company, it failed, did a bunch of stuff, and then ended up co-founding Yammer. It was a success, sold to Microsoft, stayed there for 2.5 years, really learning about scale, like what does that really mean, and really enjoyed that experience. When I left, the two things that were in my mind were, one, I could see that there were a lot of students that I went to school with who were smarter than I was, but didn't make it out. They didn't have the opportunities I ended up with. And that seemed really unfair to me. And I felt that a large part of that was the lack of quality of the schools we went to. And two, because of that experience of being picked on, I felt I was primed to look for what a younger Adam would call, who are the underdogs and how do we help them? It was only later in life that I learned language around equity and learned more about the sort of systemic oppression that has led to the unequal opportunity that we have today. So when I left Yammer, I was thinking about how do we address generational poverty? How do we look at things like that? But it led me very quickly to the education system where not all, but a lot of the problems start.
Yeah, and I'm excited to get into what the product and the problem you're solving at Abl is. But first, what was hiring like in the early days at Yammer? Were you diverse from day one? Was that a priority for your company?
Yeah, I think like most companies, so the early people at Yammer, I think, were predominantly white men who were not, who cared about people, and we were trying to build a great company. We were building a company that was trying to make other companies great companies, but we just didn't think about it. It just wasn't top of mind that this is something that if we did not proactively address, wouldn't address itself. So it wasn't it wasn't malicious, or and in fact, I remember when we hired our first woman engineer, we were very conscious of the fact that, which I think was around 15 people, so it was relatively early. We were conscious of the fact that we would probably have to watch and see, are we creating an environment that is going to be good for a woman? And we try to modify our behavior, but I don't think in the end we were conscious enough to do enough to make sure that we were creating a really inclusive environment, and that we were going above and beyond to ensure that we were finding a real diverse pool of candidates. As the company got bigger, we got better, and over time, I think we eventually sort of got there. But when I left and thinking about my next company, it became clear to me that if this is not something you really, really focus on from day one, it only becomes harder later.
Yep, and I think that's such a good call out. We live in a society that's full of lots of systemic injustices, and so if we just kind of are like, we go with the flow, we're like, hey, we're nice people, we're not racist, totally. We're just going to go with the flow. Yeah. We'll end up with a company that reflects, and a makeup that reflects those systemic injustices. It really takes effort and action to.
And it's funny because in startup land, and I wrote about this as well, like the startups are really hard. For anyone who's never started a company, it's incredibly difficult emotionally. We used to say during the early years of Yammer that the default exit of any startup is failure.
Yeah.
Which is true. More than 90% fail. And as a result of that, you sort of have this pressure to just like at all costs, we just have to build. We're running out of money, we can't get money, whatever. And at the same time, of course, you have venture capitalists, we're getting better now, saying things like, just get going, and some specifically saying, go hire your friends, go build it really quickly. And there's a whole bunch of ways in which as you said, the sort of like history of oppression gets maintained even without any malintent from anybody in the system. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love those intentions that you took into the founding of Abl. You want to, address kind of economic inequity and build a really diverse company. I think where you ended up with Abl is not where many people would have expected. It's like a third-time founder goes into education, and the problem that you found is not like an obvious problem. It wasn't the one that people were running around and talking about at conferences. So how did you? What is the problem that Abl solves? And how'd you get to that point?
So we work with school and district leaders to analyze schedule data and then help implement master schedules that address equity and access, that help optimize teaching and learning, and help maximize their finite resources. For a lot of people, those terms, master scheduling and all that, like they don't even mean anything, right? But for school and district leaders, this idea, the master schedule is really the heartbeat of the school. It is a description of the student experience. Some describe it as a moral document because in many ways it either supports all students or doesn't. When we think of school, again, we tend to think mostly of curriculum assessment, classroom management, all very important things. In terms of how I got to it, I was about to join a nonprofit called Transcend, so plug for Transcend, Jeff and Elon, who were doing school sort of design and redesign. They were trying to imagine what would school be like if we designed it for the 21st century. It's incredibly important work, and they're doing amazing work. And as I was looking to join them, I was asking a slightly different question, which is, I don't have a background in teaching and learning, so I'm not qualified to answer what school should look like. But I was asking myself, well, if people are out there in hundreds of schools figuring out what school should be, then what prevents the 130,000 schools from incrementally making progress in those directions? And those questions are about how do you reduce complexity and cost and risk for traditional school leaders who are not risk tolerant, and it was in that research that I sort of came across this problem of the master schedule, came across this problem of the way in which the resources constrain a school to perpetuate the old system or perpetuate inequality. And so it's really been an amazing journey, because so far it's sort of, it's been what we thought, which is our ability to go in and very much analyze and understand inequity in terms of student experience, and then help these schools and districts really address them in very real ways.
Yeah, what's the example of a type of scheduling inequity that a school might have without your product?
Great example. I'll rattle off a couple. One is like access to rigorous courses. Who has access to, people think that you end up in an AP course or not, as an example, or dual enrollment because of your grades, but it's not that simple. There are a lot of arbitrary reasons, and so we can analyze that. Who has access to teachers who are more experienced or who are sort of known to teach better? Class size. How even is class size by student subgroup, for example? Teacher load. If you are a student of a teacher that has 170 kids versus a student of a teacher with 70 kids, your experience is going to be very different. You're going to get a different amount of attention. And there's dozens of those types of things, which are the result of decisions made outside the classroom, not by a teacher or student, but have a significant impact on any individual student outcome.
That's wild to think about. So a bad algorithm, might give a student for no intentional reason, an overloaded teacher in too big of a class size and not the appropriate rigor of class, just because the algorithm couldn't fit them into the right
It's
classes.
not really the algorithm though, because if it was that simple, it'd be easier to fix. It's more that actually when we talked earlier about the ways in which injustice is perpetuated, schools have very limited resources, and in trying to understand how they're going to distribute those, there are just too many factors for them to understand. But at the end of the day, if you introduce a new STEM class and it turns out that only a small group of honor students are going to get into that class, and you want your best teacher to teach that class, what you're going to end up doing is draining resources and creating larger class sizes with more junior teachers for the rest of the student body. And so through all of these sort of constant evolution and changes that happen within schools, it tends to drain resources from students that have higher needs and allocate them to students who really are going to be fine. And that itself is a very controversial idea, that school is a bit of a zero-sum game from a resource standpoint. And we tend to see this sort of drift towards the students that need the least help. But that's the result of decisions people make, not an algorithm. And so part of what we do, and we're spending too much time on this, but part of what we do is when we analyze across schools, we can look at, school A, B, C, D in the same district. At this school, English language learners or students of color are in reasonable class sizes versus this school in your same district with similar demographics. Now you can see those are the result of choices. Now we can make different choices. And so that's very much about what we're trying to do, is illuminate the choices that are leading to inequity and helping them make better choices.
That's awesome. Quick reminder to folks watching, please remember to ask us your questions. You can add them in Zoom, or you can tweet at Clever with the hashtag #ElevatingEdTech. Adam, so given what Abl is doing and how deep your work is involved with equity, I can see a real need to have a diverse and inclusive team, right?
Yeah.
The problem you're solving is probably not a good problem for a group of white guys who all went to Stanford to solve. So what's your path been building that team? How did it start from day one, from founding Abl?
Yeah, well, I think even if the company wasn't focused on equity, I would have done the same thing, just because I believe it's a moral imperative, especially for someone who has had past success. That if not me, who? And so I decided before starting the company that the first 10 or 20 employees really set the culture and the tone for the company. And therefore, I was going to ensure that that first 10 or 20 came from people with diverse backgrounds in lots of different ways, so that we could make sure we're sort of building in the necessary muscle at an early enough stage to build an inclusive company. That was enormously challenging. It wasn't, while I had the passion, I didn't necessarily have the network to begin with. And so there was at first just a lot of work to expand my own network so that I had access to and built trust with lots of different people. So I wasn't just hiring a group of my friends who might happen to look like me.
Yep. And I think we were talking earlier about how I think it's really easy for founders to kind of underestimate the scope of the work.
Yeah.
You know, to think like, oh, you know, I care about diversity. I want to do something. I'm going to go to one female engineering conference, and then that'll solve things. Or I'm going to, you know, tweak the language in my job descriptions a little bit, and then it'll all be okay.
Right.
And so I think I really appreciate you saying that it wasn't easy. It wasn't just a mindset shift or an intention. You really had to do a lot of the work. And what, you know, early on in building that really diverse team of 10 or 20, like, how did you do it? How did you go beyond your network and find candidates who probably wouldn't be the default candidates you talk to?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I mean, before this, you had mentioned that article by Bezos about how people underestimate the scope and therefore they give up early. And I think that's one of the core messages that I think we'll talk more about, which is that if you believe in this, you have to understand that it's going to be a continuous challenge that you believe in enough to overcome. And there's no amount of challenge that you won't continue to push on because you believe in it. And that's how that works, you know? And I remember having a conversation with a group of founders and one person asked, hey, so how do we know that actually building a diverse team results in sort of economic advantage or something? And, or I think what they said is, how do we know that like having this as one of our values is going to result in economic advantage? And my response was like, if it's truly a value of yours, you would do it even if it wasn't an advantage. And that's the point, you know? But in the early days, I think it was just a lot of like trying to literally reach out to people I didn't know, who I knew were in other communities who were, and it's super awkward at first because what a weird reason to reach out to someone. There's a bunch of problems just with doing that. But I really wanted to better understand, better build trust, build communities. And I think a lot of it, frankly, as I look back, was educating myself that because most of my time was not being historically spent with leaders of color or women engineering leaders, the more time I could spend just hanging out, the more I could just understand and speak, you know, more eloquently and in a way that resonated with that group and just be more, do you know what I mean? Like, it's very easy if you're in an insular community to think, as you're saying, like, oh, I just need to pick words I use or whatever. But I think when you begin to really hang out, build empathy for people who may not have the same background as you, it just changes your whole perspective on how you approach them and how you approach your own life and how you learn from them. So it was just a tremendous amount of time doing that. And then frankly, it was in the sourcing of candidates, we were very intentional to say like, look, there are, it is harder to find women engineers, for example. So if we're just gonna quote unquote cast a wide net, we're gonna get 90% men. And so we have to be much more intentional about looking, where are we gonna find, how do we make sure that we're seeing the best possible candidates? We're not lowering the bar, we never have, but from a diverse pool of candidates so that we can really evaluate apples and apples.
Yeah, and that's amazing. And when did things start to pay off? You know, it sounds like there was a tough early phase where you were kind of building bridges and growing your network, and it was a lot of just perspective building. When did things start to become easier? Was it with the first hire or the 10th hire? Or
well, easier from a hiring perspective or easier from a company perspective?
Let's start with hiring, and then we'll talk about the company perspective in a second.
You know, pretty quickly, I'd say actually. I'd say after we had about 10 employees and it was a pretty diverse group of people, I felt like finding and hiring, getting a diverse candidate pool and having them want to work at the company got easier. So that part seemed to work very quickly. If you think about a company starting at 30 employees or 40 employees, how hard that is. For us, it worked pretty quickly. You know, we had actually, it was funny. We had a very senior white gentleman who was very senior, and he decided to work at Abl because we were the only company where a woman interviewed him.
Wow.
So yeah, and there were a lot of instances like that where, if you go to interview and there are people who you believe are going to be accepting of you, and you believe it's a place where you'll feel belonging, then you're likely to want to work there. And we did a lot of things early on. We have what we think of as an equitable pay policy, where we don't do any negotiation. We sort of say, look, based on the role and band you're at, here are a couple options that trade off salary and equity, but like everyone at your band is being paid within this, not just with this range, but like the same sort of overall comp. And as a result, you don't have to worry that because you're a group that was underrepresented and therefore didn't get paid as much, that you're going to be underpaid at this company. We did those not because they were a good signal, but because we believed in them. They turned out to be really good signals for people to want to work here.
Yeah. And Adam, I love your point that building a diverse team is a moral imperative. It's not a tactical advantage or a strategic advantage, but I think that it's worth hitting on that this is a place where you can really build up diversity debt. If you're a team of 50 white guys, you're going to struggle to recruit the best talent.
Really hard.
It's going to be almost impossible. But if you've built a diverse team early on, all of a sudden you have this incredible competitive advantage, as well as doing the right moral thing. But I think you really pushed me on this. It's not just about bringing the right people into the door, because you can hire in a really great and diverse way, but then have not a great situation in your company.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe inclusion might be a good word for kind of that, making everyone who's on the team feel welcome and have the team working well. And how's that going?
Yeah. Well, in fact, just to wrap a bow on the first part, so we've got our bases covered. Yeah. So in the beginning, before we had a big team, we were focused on how do we hire and how do we bring on and hire, retain, a group from diverse backgrounds. And so everything from what is our policy for pay to how do we give offers, to things like job descriptions, to where do we post, to making sure that every interview panel had a diverse group of people, to so there was a lot of work we did in those early days to making sure that every job role had a rubric so that we weren't just interviewing for culture fit or something. We did all of that work, and after time, as we began to sort of build up this team, what became very obvious, which I don't think was totally obvious to me in the beginning, was if you want to get something done really fast with a small group of people, hire a bunch of people that already know each other and who talk the same and come from the same backgrounds, because they'll be normed, right? Now, the downside is they're going to have a homogenous way of looking at the world. So they're not necessarily going to explore a very wide search area. There's a lot of downsides to that.
They'll have blind spots.
They'll have blind spots, but they'll move really fast. When you begin to bring together what I joke is a group of diverse strangers, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to figure out what are the norms, how do we communicate? And what I learned through that process was most of us, even if you've worked in a company, if you're in Silicon Valley, even if you've worked in a company that claims to have some diversity by the numbers, there probably is a culture that was based on the majority group, because that was the one that founded the company. So one of the examples I give is a lot of engineers, white male engineers, tend to, some of them tend to be a little on the spectrum, and they tend to want to negotiate or resolve conflicts in dispassionate ways. So let's not raise our voice, let's not yell at each other, let's argue facts, and then And I think even for me as one of those people to some degree, I thought, well, that was just the humane best way to resolve conflict. And later to learn that that's really a cultural norm, and there are downsides to that. Namely, if you're hiding your strength of your feelings, that's not good. And other cultures have a culture of like, let's get it out there. Let's be fully honest about the way we feel about this, because that'll be easier to negotiate this. And for them, if somebody raises their voice or cries, it's not a big deal. That's just part of conflict negotiation, And there's value to that, because they look at the sort of dispassionate way as passive aggressive. So both sides kind of have so what do you do if you're in a company that doesn't have one of those? How do you, I think growing up mostly didn't learn how to communicate across difference. How can we be accepting of other communication styles, conflict resolution styles? We just didn't learn that. And so before starting Abl, actually, I was doing a tour of elementary schools, and I saw that they were doing this communication and social emotional work in sort of circle time. And I saw this like third grader who was talking about being bullied and how he felt about that. And this other kid stood up and echoed it. And I was watching this thing, and I was like, I've never worked with adults that could communicate or resolve conflicts this well. And these are third graders. And so I said, we didn't learn this. And when I started a company, we're going to do this work. And so early on in the company's history, and we haven't been, consistent about it always, but we were pretty consistent early on. We began introducing exercises on a weekly basis to just work on how we communicated, how we resolved conflict. We probably started this at 15 employees or so, 10 or 15, with, we would do reflective listening exercises every week. It was a difficult question. You sort of, you ask your pair a question, then you listen, and then you reflect back what you heard, but without interpretation, you just repeat. And we did that for months. And it did a huge amount to build empathy and help people understand the foundation of trust is listening. But then we moved on to things like conflict resolution. And at one point, one of our engineers said they wanted to do a sort of a 5-week course on nonviolent communication. So as a company, we did a 5-week course on nonviolent communication led by one of our engineers. Ravi. It was amazing, actually. I learned a ton from that. We've done a bunch of scenario work, which is how do you deal with difficult conversations? Say you're in an interview roundup and you have a bad feeling about a candidate. Is that bias? Is that, we did scenario work. Let's explore those conversations to make sure we can have those open conversations. So anyway, all that is to say, I think the most important work we've done is not in the hiring process. That was important. It's been, how do you create a company which is inclusive, which I define as people from different backgrounds can feel like they belong. They can feel like they can bring their whole selves and they feel seen and heard in that organization. To me, that's the work, that's the hard work. And it's hard work. In the first year, we were talking about this before, it was just hard. It was like, there was just hard about it, and I think, but it got easier as time went on. And now I don't think we're perfect. I think that this is never an area where you can take your eye off the ball or stop working, because we're dealing with hundreds of years of injustice in different ways. So thinking you're going to fix it in a year or two is naive. But I feel, I believe that people from different backgrounds feel more belonging in Abl than had we started and done this really late in the game. Yeah. And so I think it's totally paid off now, and it doesn't feel as hard or onerous, but there's more work to do.
I love that. And I love your example about how there's sort of default culture that appears. Like,
yeah.
Engineering culture is a certain way. At Abl, with the work and the training and the intentionality that you put into this, is there sort of one Abl culture, which maybe is a little bit of a mishmash of different perspectives that people bring? Or is it really like there's lots of different cultures at Abl and you're really good at communicating across them?
That's a very good question. I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I think mostly companies end up creating a culture.
Yeah.
And I think that the goal of the culture is to be very inclusive, and you feel that in terms of people wanting to be understanding of different points of view. Early on, we would talk about how to have an inclusive culture, you also must be exclusive. Like, we can't hire racists, or mm-hmm. We're a culture that values humility, which is for us a part of inclusivity, but therefore people who are used to being in a sort of competitive, arrogant culture, which can be a very successful company, wouldn't work well in Abl. So I do think there is a culture that is exclusive of certain things, but it is a culture that is somewhat defined by our belief that we need to improve ourselves to build an inclusive culture. It's not just a thing that happens, but it's an individual responsibility, and we should be mindful of it and continually trying to press in that area.
Yeah. And you mentioned just a second ago that you're like, hey, I feel like pretty proud of the work we've done. It's not perfect, but mm-hmm. I think it's great, and maybe better than most places. How do you monitor that? What's the sort of, what data do you gather, and what's kind of the feedback loop to make sure that people are feeling welcome? And
yeah, that's a great question. So obviously there's the actual numbers of like who's in the company, and yep. We did some work where for a while we were sort of looking at gender and race, ethnicity, and we moved a little bit towards asking, well, for different team types, different role types, there's actually different groups that are underrepresented In marketing, women are not underrepresented, but in engineering they are. And so what we would encourage to do is think about each team as what would be underrepresented and how do we increase representation for that team based on what's underrepresented. I think that was pretty healthy. And we continue.
The opposite could be really unhealthy. Like, oh, we're going to mask or hide our terrible diversity on our engineering team by like lumping those numbers together with our marketing.
Yes, which we see all the time, right? And happens in schools too, in terms of how they think about like, oh, look at how much, look at the representation of English language learners in honors courses. And you're like, oh, but that's actually in AP Spanish, right? Exactly. And so we try to disambiguate that a little bit. We obviously do sort of engagement surveys and things, but I think that's an area where we can do better and learn a lot. To be honest, the way that we've monitored ourselves to date is that we've created an organization that feels comfortable speaking up about these. And so there's sort of a lot of just internal monitoring and a lot of comfort people have with raising their hand and saying, hey, I see something here, whether that's, I remember when, wasn't that long ago, when someone said, hey, what do we do when you're at a conference and someone who's even like a customer starts to make inappropriate comments, and we probably should have a code of conduct and things like that. And so I think there's a lot of just sort of like group monitoring, but I think an area where we can improve, and I'd like to learn from others, is how do we better monitor that?
Yeah, one thing that I don't think there's a ton of quick wins in this space. I mean, we've talked a lot. This is hard and tough work. One thing that we've been doing for a while at Clever and just absolutely love is a regular culture survey using Culture Amp.
Yeah, we do a Culture Amp survey.
Yeah, and it's it's definitely not the only thing that you need, but as it is,
I think it's a good one.
Yeah, it's anonymous. People can be really candid.
Yeah.
You get
actually
benchmarks compared to other companies.
When we did that survey, one of the things that surfaced from it was people saying they one of the lower scores was, did they feel comfortable with dissent? And as a result of that, we began doing additional types of exercises to try to figure out, like, how do you encourage dissent, or what are the mechanisms for that? And I think when we ran it, that got better, but so that was really helpful to try to find particular areas that we can work. My belief, by the way, is that the way you work on these things is through exercises and routines, not policies. Policies are great and important. I think you need the right policies, but policies tend to not be something people think about every day. And so if you want to, things like meeting norms that you reinforce and sort of try to push on, things like exercises that you do on a very regular basis. It's really by changing mindset that we improve in these areas. So I think that's the hard work, is like not just policy, but changing mindset.
Yep. And so we're getting close to the end. Please make sure to get your questions in, everyone. Ask them through Zoom or tweet at Clever, #elevatingedtech. But Adam, we've talked a lot about some of the challenges, right?
Yeah.
That this isn't easy. It takes a lot of work. Even if you're intentional, you still probably are going to make mistakes. We've definitely both made mistakes. But let's talk about the payoff.
Yeah.
What are some of the benefits that you've seen at Abl from all the work you put into building a diverse team and helping everyone work well across cultural boundaries?
I'm obviously biased, but I love my company. And I look at the bravery of the individuals that now can speak up about these issues. So to have it so that people can speak up and feel okay dissenting, or feel okay saying, here's an area where we have a blind spot, that makes me really proud. And I look at the degree of trust that we've built within the company, and the way in which that aids all decision making, not just about inclusion issues, but everything. I think that the care that people have for each other on the team really shines. So yeah, now I feel like there's it's a lot of payoff right now. It was hard work early on. Now it feels like we have to continue doing the work, but it's becoming more natural to do that. And also, people are self-selecting into the company who care about these things. And obviously, we're a company that is trying to improve equity in schools, and that's great for us. We've had almost no attrition. People don't leave.
It's amazing.
People, I think, generally are happy and like working there. And it's not because we have ping pong tables and drink beer and stuff. I think it's because they feel belonging and they feel trust for their fellow colleagues. And I think we're always improving. We've been doing a lot more sort of cross-functional work, and really amazing how well that's been going, with people from different teams coming together because they sort of share this trust.
Yeah, I think it's a great call out, because a lot of the work that you talked about doing from the perspective of inclusion having difficult conversations and communicating clearly. Like those problems will come up and cross team boundaries because you're going to have multiple, no matter, once your company gets to 30 or 40 people, you will have multiple cultures within the company. Even if everyone is a white male. Engineers will have a different perspective than marketing, and practicing or intentionally training around communication across boundaries is going to have massive payoffs.
Totally. And when we do these communication exercises or things like that, we do a lot of these that are offsites too. We intentionally mix people from different teams. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to get to know each other and also do the work across boundaries. And some of that work is to, we did one recently, and I'll admit this one was very risky and dangerous, but I'm still happy with it. Probably did this 2 months ago or so. And it was an exercise I made up called Label Stereotypes in Me. And the idea, and you can see how dangerous this would be, but the idea, and this is all optional in terms of how much you reveal, but you'd be paired up. And the idea behind this exercise, and I think, by the way, this is an important message, in all the work we do around D&I or equity in schools, it is very easy and in fact beneficial for us to talk about groups. Our students of color being disadvantaged, English language learners, which is fine from a sort of a systemic standpoint. But at the individual level, people are not groups, people are individuals. And as we've done work on D&I in the company, I felt it very important for us to remember that you can't make assumptions about someone, even if you think you're benefiting them just because of a group they're part of. So I wanted to do an exercise that really called that part out. And so the exercise was basically, you would say, here's a bunch of labels that could be applied to me. I'm a white male, I'm American born, but grandparents are from Italy, I'm straight or whatever they are. And because of those labels, here are assumptions people could make about me. Here are stereotypes. I'm a multiple founder. People may think I'm materialistic or, whatever they are. But here's how I describe myself. And then you sort of dissuade those. And then you kind of do a reflection on that. The exercise was pretty powerful because you get that sense of like, people just think of themselves different than whatever groups or labels you might apply to them. Or sometimes they identify with those, but you can't know that ahead of time. That's a big part of belonging in a company too, truly knowing people as individuals and not as members of groups. So it was sort of off tangent, but what was the question?
We covered it.
Yeah.
So just a couple of minutes left until you turn to questions. So get your last questions in. We've got some great ones rolling in. There's a ton more things I'd love to ask you, but I think that the last question I'll ask before we turn to the resources is, what advice would you give to an early stage ed tech founder? Maybe someone with a team of a couple co-founders, or maybe making their first couple hires. What would be the number one thing you'd say to them, based on your experience from Abl?
Well, if you think, one, start now, but two, decide how much you believe in this. If it's something you're doing because you think it'll just help the company or you'll get hit in the media or something, then you're not going to be successful. You might as well not even try. If you truly believe in it, then to your point about scope, like do it because you believe in it and don't stop. And for me, I know that the more we ran into challenges because of this path we were taking, the more it animated me, because those challenges represented symbols of the hundreds of years of oppression or unequal opportunity. And so each of these challenges are like, this makes me angry. I'm going to actually double down my efforts because I'm angry about the fact that women are paid less and therefore we have to do some special things. Like, as opposed to taking these as, oh, this is just getting harder, we can't keep doing this because of the company. So I think it's really just about get to the root of your commitment on it. The last thing I'd say is on that point about being careful about groups. Each of us at some point in our life have experienced something where we felt othered and it's important to dig into that, to connect with that as a way of connecting with other people. I can't identify with the experience of people from other groups, but I can connect with them on some of those experiences in a way that will animate me, in a way that will create connection and belonging between us. And again, I think that is such a huge part of the work itself.
I love that. I would also add, if you're on the fence, if you're like, I don't know if this feels like a moral imperative to me, the thing that I'd recommend doing, I'm sure you've done this, Adam, is go and find people in your network or your extended network and listen to their experiences. Because I think the thing that turned this from like an academic thing for me into more of like a heart and moral thing was hearing some of the challenges some of my female friends have had and some of my friends of color have had, or their friends of friends that have had those experiences. And there is something about being human that like hearing another person's story face to face is so compelling.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we sat down, I asked you for some of your top recommended books or resources for early stage edtech entrepreneurs. You put together an amazing list. Can you talk us through some of the highlights? We're going to put them up on a slide.
Yeah, just to remember them. I'll go through them quickly because there's so many, and they're very different. And some of them are specific to this topic, and some aren't. But Jennifer Brown just released this book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader. And she's pretty awesome, and I think this is at the core of everything we're talking about, as is Dare to Lead. Of course, Brene Brown is amazing. I think taught me a lot about the value of vulnerability and how you leverage that to connect with people and feel connected. And if you've never heard of the 5 functions of a team, it's really fascinating and a good read as well. The 5th discipline is one of the best just management books ever written by Peter Senge, which isn't specifically about this topic, but very much is sort of about building companies. Complexity, I just threw in there as a wild card. It was very influential to me. It has nothing to do with companies, but it's about complexity theory, and it's influenced the way I think about building companies quite a lot. Some people might say it's a dry read. I thought it was super engaging. And the other wild card I threw in was Winners Take All, because I think that it does a lot to speak to the biases probably a lot of us have in the startup community about whether we're doing enough and sort of what we're doing that's helping the system or not. I mean, the basis of the book is that if we're still perpetuating a system that disadvantages certain people, then it's not enough to give back, as opposed to saying, no, actually, we may have to make some very serious changes that may end up disadvantaging ourselves, not on purpose, just as part of writing the system. And so if you think about reading that book, for me, helps animate me to do the hard work around D&I that needs to happen.
I love it. And I think if you read all 6 of those books, not only will you be a better startup leader, you'll also be a better person.
Yeah.
So you should carve out some time and hit Amazon up for some purchases. All right, we have some great questions, so we're gonna get into those right now. So the first one's from an anonymous asker. And she said, as a Black woman in STEM and management, I'm often the only woman of color or person of color in the room. This can sometimes be very isolating. How do you assist employees like herself and others to be assertive and feel as if their voice and opinions are valued?
It is a very, very good question, and a very difficult question too, because it's very easy for, what I've often heard people say is, speak up, and if that company isn't accepting of you, move on. But it's not that easy if you don't feel like there's quite as much opportunity out there because of other disadvantages. I think it is important to find allies through what I would consider sort of gradual reveal. I mean, the way we build trust in general is doing gradual reveal and seeing what comes back to us. And in particular, I guess the only thing I would advise is, like, we can't know, just as they don't know your experience, you don't know their experience. And the way that you will find allies in this is through gradual reveals. It is true that it is unfortunately true that it is not necessarily safe to just speak up, because you don't know about the other people. You don't know that they're gonna accept what you say. And that is the unfortunate truth. So I guess my recommendation would be is that looking through allies, through gradual reveals, and then seeing if you can't sort of build momentum around that. If you feel unsafe, and I mean that in every possible way, emotionally or in an organization, obviously, in an ideal world, you would be, there are organizations out there that are accepting of people from diverse backgrounds and try to build belonging. But I also understand that not everyone has the same ease of moving between companies, that's a simple thing.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And good luck. We're thinking about you. Next question is from Luann. Luann asks, how did you expand your network and introduce yourself to new communities? What's an example of a pitch that resonated with people who were unlike you?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it was just being honest. Like, it was, I literally came to people and said, here's my story. I'm trying to do this differently, and I need help because I don't know what I'm doing. And actually, this happened a little later, but one of the most impactful things that worked for me was when I was writing the article on starting a diverse team. I knew that doing that was somewhat dangerous. And in fact, at the time I was writing that, my own understanding of the issues was still relatively naive. My language was somewhat naive. So I was very afraid about sounding like an idiot. So what I did was, as I wrote it, I started to share it with people from the community, and I used the writing of it as an excuse to meet people in the sort of D&I community. And I'd say, who else should I talk to? And they'd introduce me to people. And I'd say, hey, I've had this experience. I'm trying to write about this. Will you help me? And by the time I had published it, over 100 people had read it and provided feedback on it. And it was a 3 or 4 month process. But all of a sudden, like, I suddenly knew all these people and frankly learned a tremendous amount from them. The piece changed quite a lot from their feedback as I was saying things that were naive or insensitive, so that sort of gave a facility for me to educate myself and to meet other people.
I remember reading an early draft and reading the final version, and I was blown away by how that article grew. And the Medium article that Adam's referencing, we'll include a link when we share out the video recording. Next question is from Erin. She said, you mentioned protecting your company culture by avoiding hiring racist folks. And I think you also mentioned like hyper-aggressive folks as someone who wouldn't fit into the culture. How do you actually do that? What are your hiring practices or interviewing techniques to make sure that folks are going to, be a part of those cultural
I am so glad you asked this question, Erin, because let me tell you a quick story. So in the beginning, we said, part of building a diverse and inclusive culture is having the least biased interview process you can. And so we watched, unconscious bias training. We built up rubrics. We said each person on the team has a particular part of the rubric that they're supposed to interview for. And if you sort of have sense things that are outside the rubric, those shouldn't apply because those are cultural fit issues. We should be really hiring based on skill. And that felt great. Then we ended up, and obviously cannot go into any details, but we ended up hiring someone who didn't have the same values, who didn't believe these things. And in fact, sort of the opposite. I mean, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say racist, but the opposite. And we all, once this resolved itself, this issue, we were like, how did that happen? How did this inclusive company do this? And what we realized was interviewing is a biased process. There's no way to take the bias out, period. And so on top of the rubrics and that's what we do, we define an interview panel ahead of time, we define the rubric, who's gonna interview for what, how do we come together, we do roundups where we discuss these things. But the thing we introduced is this idea that when we start an interview roundup, our head of recruiting usually starts by saying, just a reminder, this is a safe and a brave space. You should feel comfortable speaking about things that you don't know how to place, and we will talk about them. And in us talking about these things, we may expose our biases, and that's okay to do because that's how we learn. But we trust each other, and therefore it'd be better. Or we may expose that we're missing something in our rubric, or that there is a flag that we should care about here. And I think I mentioned this earlier. We began doing this scenario work where a group of 4 or 5 people would get together, and one of them would pretend they were giving feedback on a candidate, and they would have a prompt like, the candidate made a political comment that made you uncomfortable. Didn't specify what it was, or how do you have that conversation, or the candidate was dressed inappropriately. The prompt didn't mention the gender or what the dress was. And we wanted to get to a point where we felt like we could have those conversations, because we have had things happen where a candidate made, a male candidate made a comment about a female interviewer when the next person came in. And it's like, well, that's not appropriate. How do we have a conversation about that and why that's not appropriate? But there are gradations of that. That's an obvious one, but there are many gradations that are less obvious. So for us, it was like, do all the things you're supposed to do, the rubrics and all that stuff, but leave space for the discussions that could surface your biases, because that's actually really valuable work as well. Sometimes reveals things that are important, sometimes reveals your biases. Both of those are actually really important.
I love that. And can I just ask a quick follow-up? Like, let's say that I'm in an interview panel and I say something that really reveals kind of a terrible bias. Like, I don't believe this person would have the chops to succeed here. And I'm not really grounding that in evidence. It's more like I just have this feeling.
Yeah.
How would the interview panel sort of help pull that out and say, hey, Dan, maybe that's more your bias than it is, a good read on whether this would be a successful candidate?
Yeah, and we sort of try to coach around this as well. I mean, to start with, if you have a feeling, it's okay to say, hey, I have a feeling, I'm afraid of being judged because I don't know how to place it. And so I'm mentioning it so that we can talk about it.
Yeah.
So like name that. And then for the other people to say like, not judging, but can we dig into that? So was there something they said specifically? Is there, and then we asked, did anyone else feel that? Because it is the case that if there are things that are shared, we have to dig in and understand why, but maybe you learn you're the only one. And that's a really important thing too. Why did nobody else do that? Maybe there's a follow-up we need to have with the candidate. But it's only through that conversation that we'll discover those. And at the end of the day, we're trying to get down to what is the things they did or said that led you to that? Is that reasonable? Does that align with our values or not, or the rubric? We're trying to get it to that level, but sometimes it takes digging to get it to that level.
Yeah. I love that idea of, maybe that I would raise this as a, hey, I'm not sure if this is a bias or a good insight, and then the group can kind of help us figure it out, rather than me having to sort of like, this is my truth, I'm going to fight for it.
And by the way, I'm nervous about being judged by saying this. So go easy on me.
Yep.
And then saying it. And that's like an appropriate thing to say.
Yeah. And shows you some awareness. I'll get a great question from Nick W, who asked, do you have any tips for increasing inclusiveness of a culture when there's remote team members, where some folks are in an office and some folks are working remotely?
This is something we're actively working on right now. We bought a company in May, and it was a 100% remote company. And so it's now September, and I'd say we're still early days. My guess is if you asked our remote employees, they'd say we've made progress, but have a lot of work to do. But some of it is we've been experimenting with just how we do meetings, and we changed our AV system so that was helpful. We've been intentional with our company meetings when we do this pair work to pair remote people and on-site people. We sort of assign them offices and let them go. And we had an offsite or brought everyone together. But I think this is an area we still have a lot to grow and learn at. I think we're a C.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're starting to work on this a little bit too. I think one of the things that I've learned, this isn't a solution, this is an acknowledgement of the challenge, is just, when we're in person, we have so much signal, right? I can see that I'm smiling. I can see how he's moving. I can feel how my thoughts, I may have offended you. I can tell and course correct. And when we go remote, we just lose so much of that non-verbal signal, and it makes communication a lot more challenging. You have to be a lot more explicit about things.
Yeah, we've experimented with things like, could we do more meetings over VC, even when we're all in the office? Sorry. And I think we have more experimentation like that to do, though.
Yeah. We'll take one, maybe two more questions. Here's one from an anonymous question asker who said, there may or may not be economic advantage to hiring a diverse group of employees, but are there benefits that you've seen impacting your product or your business from having a diverse group?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially we're a product that's focused on equity. And I think that the issues that get surfaced, the ideas that get surfaced, my guess is when we do hack days, like a lot of companies, my guess is a lot of the variance of the ideas that are raised are probably much greater. So I would say absolutely, both in terms of the external product and how we, not just that, but how we treat our customers, like what is our customer experience and how can we be more empathetic to them? What should our product be? What should we be looking at? As well, what our messaging, but as well as like, how do we build a good company? So at this point, yeah, I mean, I am a believer that it's funny, Peter Senge's A Fifth Discipline and a more recent book called The Principles of Product Development Flow talk a lot about how a lot of our systems of product development, like Scrum, were modeled after manufacturing. But manufacturing is all about reducing variance. It's create efficiency, reduce variance. But in product development, like what a lot of us do, it's about increased variance. We want to see a wider set of ideas, and we want to experiment really quickly. And having people from more diverse backgrounds creates a wider set of ideas. And when you think about it that way, it's very clear it isn't just about, of course, gender and race. Those are components, but those components influence other aspects of background. Different people who come from different economic backgrounds, people who come from different growing up experiences or countries or places, and on those grounds, we have a lot of ground to cover as well for ourselves. Like if everyone in your company is from a large urban center or something, that's going to have there'll be a very different set of life experiences and biases than people who might come from the middle of the country or from rural areas. And there's value in those experiences as we're thinking about the universe of solutions.
Thanks, Adam. One last question. This one's from Ron. You mentioned how you never lower the bar for hiring.
Right.
But have you ever thought about maybe there's I'll read this, but have there been instances of hiring that where you ensure diversity, where a candidate is like maybe almost a good fit, and with a little bit of additional training or education, you could see them succeeding in the role? Like maybe I've heard this phrase is like, you can hire for like, where is somebody right now? Or maybe you can hire based on like their velocity or their growth. How have you thought about that?
That's a really good question. One of the challenges that I just want to name with things like that is the worst thing that can happen, and this is feedback I got from my team, by the way, is that as you're attempting to bring in a more diverse pool of candidates from more underrepresented backgrounds, the worst thing that can happen is for someone to believe they were hired not because they were right for the job, but because of their race or gender. That's just not a good thing. That doesn't set them up for success. It doesn't set the team up for success if they believe that. So there's a bunch of downstream impacts of that being true. Therefore, the way we've handled that is, it's true that if we were looking for candidates and we said, look, we have to have a diverse pool of candidates that we're evaluating against, but we're just not seeing enough. Should we then look at our rubric to see are there aspects of our rubric that are excluding certain people? We'd rather do that and say, like, we've defined the role and we're going to hire the best person for that role, but we can redefine the role if we feel like we're not getting the right candidates. But the person we hire should know they were hired because they were the right person for that role. So it's a little nuanced maybe, but I think that's the way I look at it.
Yeah. I love that. Well, Adam, this is awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think before we go, I just want to talk about the rest of the Elevating EdTech series. We've got some other great discussions coming up. In October 9th, I'll be talking with Janal, the founder of Schoolmint, about how to raise money and get acquired. Janal's both sold Schoolmint and he's also acquired companies, running kind of a PE firm. So
He's great.
Really excited about that conversation. A week after that, I'll be talking with Dan Kogan-Drew, who's the co-founder and chief product officer at Newsela, about going from passion. Dan started as a teacher and a tech director in schools to product market fit. Newsela is, on a tear. And then a couple weeks after that, I'll be speaking with Michelle Brown, who is a good friend and the founder and the CEO of CommonLit, about how to build impactful partnerships. CommonLit has just gone out and made these incredible partnerships around content and distribution that have really helped them become really like ubiquitous in K-12 schools. So it's a great lineup, and I hope to see you for some of those future conversations. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.